Hi, today I would like to discuss the most important shifts in how we understand regional development. What we are about to discuss is not merely a collection of theories, it is in many ways a transformation in how economists, geographers, and policymakers perceive the world around us. Let me begin with a simple observation. If you travel from the Czech Republic to Ghana by a car, or even from western part to eastern part of little Slovakia, you will notice striking differences in development. Some regions are vibrant, innovative, full of opportunities. Others struggle with unemployment, stagnation, or even decline. For decades, scholars attempted to explain these differences using what we might call classical approaches. They looked at capital, labor, infrastructure, and external investments. And while these factors do matter, by the late 20th century it became increasingly clear that they do not tell the whole story. In the 1980s, a significant intellectual shift occurred. Researchers began to focus on something less tangible. Yes, less tangible, yet profoundly influential. Institutions, culture, and the internal dynamics of regions. This was not just a minor adjustment in perspective, it was a paradigm shift. Instead of asking, what external resources can we bring into a region, scholars began to ask, what is already inside the region and how does it shape development? This is what we refer to as the institutional approach to regional development. And I want you to understand institutions here in a broad sense. We are not speaking only about ministries, offices, or bureaucratic structures. Institutions also include habits, traditions, norms of behavior, trust between actors, and the unwritten rules that guide economic and social interactions. In many ways, these informal institutions are even more powerful than formal ones. Now, why did this shift happen? One of the reasons was the growing recognition that technological advancement and innovation do not follow predictable paths. They disrupt markets, they create new industries, and they render old ones obsolete. Think, for example, of how digitalization has transformed entire sectors in the last 2 decades. No central planner could have fully predicted this. Innovation emerges through complex interactions, often accidental, often rooted in specific local environments. At the same time, researchers began to examine how firms actually operate, not as abstract entities in economic models, but as real organizations composed of people, relationships, and internal structures. How do companies communicate internally? How do they collaborate with other firms? How do they learn? These questions became central. And finally, there was a growing interest in the role of networks, networks of firms, institutions, and individuals. It became clear that no company operates in isolation. Every firm is embedded in a web of relationships, and these relationships profoundly influence its behavior and performance. This brings us to a key concept that you must understand: the move from exogenous to endogenous development. For a long time, regional policy was based on the idea that development could be stimulated from outside. Governments would attract foreign investors, offer tax incentives, or build infrastructure in the hope that growth would follow. And sometimes it did, but often the results were disappointing or unsustainable. The institutional approach challenges this logic. It suggests that sustainable development must be built from within. It must rely on the internal potential of a region, its people, its knowledge, its traditions, and its networks. This does not mean that external factors are irrelevant. but it does mean that they are not sufficient on their own. Let us now turn to one of the most influential concepts that emerged from this line of thinking, the theory of industrial districts. This theory was inspired by observations in Italy, particularly in regions such as Veneto, Emilia-Romagna, and Tuscany. These regions did not fit the traditional model of industrial development. They were not dominated by large corporations or massive factories. Instead, they were characterized by a dense network of small and medium-sized enterprises. What is fascinating is that these regions experienced remarkable economic success after the Second World War. They had low unemployment, high levels of economic activity, and strong export performance. And yet, their structure was fundamentally different from the large-scale industrial systems we see in places like northern Italy or Germany. So what explains their success? First, there was a high degree of specialization. Each firm focused on a specific stage of production. One company might produce raw materials, another would process them, a third would handle design, and yet another would manage distribution. This division of labor allowed for efficiency and flexibility. Second, these firms were located close to each other. This spatial proximity reduced transaction costs and facilitated communication. More importantly, it allowed for the rapid exchange of knowledge and ideas. If one firm developed a new technique, others could quickly learn and adapt. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there was a strong sense of community. These regions were characterized by shared values, trust, and social cohesion. Business relationships were not purely transactional, they were embedded in social networks. This created an environment in which cooperation could flourish even among competitors. However, as responsible scholars, we must also acknowledge the darker side of this model. Some of its success was based on the exploitation of cheap labor. Workers such as students, retirees, or women on maternity leave were often employed under precarious conditions. In some cases, labor protections were weak or absent. This reminds us that economic success should not be evaluated solely in terms of output or growth, but also in terms of social justice. Now, an important question arises. Can this model be transferred to other regions? Can we simply replicate the Italian experience in Slovakia, the Czech Republic, or Ghana? The answer is not straightforward. The success of industrial districts was deeply rooted in local culture, history, and institutions. These are not easily replicated. Nevertheless, certain principles can be applied. Regions can support small and medium-sized enterprises, encourage cooperation, and invest in local capabilities. In this sense, the theory provides guidance rather than a blueprint. Closely related to the concept of industrial districts is the idea of clusters. While the term cluster became popular only in the 1990s, the underlying idea is similar. A cluster is a geographical concentration of interconnected companies, suppliers, service providers, and institutions. What distinguishes clusters is the emphasis on both competition and cooperation. Firms compete in the market, but they also collaborate in areas such as research, training, or infrastructure. Let me give you a practical example from the Czech Republic. The automotive industry around Mladá Boleslav, centered on Škoda Auto, represents a classic cluster. You have the main producer, but also a network of suppliers, logistics companies, research institutions, and educational facilities. The proximity of these actors creates synergies that enhance productivity and innovation. We can observe similar dynamics in Slovakia, particularly in the western part of the country, where the automotive sector has become highly concentrated. Cities like Bratislava and Trnava host major production facilities, but also benefit from a network of suppliers and supporting institutions. This concentration has contributed significantly to the economic growth of the region. However, clusters are not always beneficial. There is a risk of what we call disembedding, where local firms become dependent on decisions made outside the region. For example, if a multinational corporation controls a cluster, strategic decisions may be made at its headquarters abroad. This can limit the autonomy and long-term development of the region. We see similar challenges in developing countries such as Ghana. In sectors like cocoa production, local actors are part of global networks, but they often occupy subordinate positions. The most profitable activities, such as processing and branding, may take place elsewhere. This highlights the importance of not only participating in networks, but also controlling key functions within them. This brings us to perhaps the most important concept in contemporary regional development: innovation. In today's global economy, traditional advantages such as cheap labor are no longer sufficient for long-term competitiveness. Regions must rely on their ability to generate and apply new knowledge. Here we must distinguish between two types of knowledge: codified and tacit. Codified knowledge is formalized and can be easily transmitted. It includes manuals, instructions, and standardized procedures. Tacit knowledge, on the other hand, is deeply embedded in experience. It is difficult to articulate and even more difficult to transfer. Consider a skilled technician in a Slovak manufacturing plant. He may know how to adjust a machine in a way that improves efficiency. This knowledge is not written down. It is the result of years of experience. If he leaves the company, that knowledge may be lost. And this is the essence of tacit knowledge. The ability to generate and retain such knowledge is a key source of competitive advantage. And this is where the concept of learning regions comes into play. A learning region is one in which firms, institutions, and individuals continuously interact, share knowledge, and innovate. Learning does not occur only in formal settings, it happens through practice, through experimentation, through collaboration. We speak of learning by doing, learning by using, learning by searching, and learning by cooperating. All these processes contribute to the creation of new knowledge. Let me illustrate this with a simple example. Imagine a small technology startup in Bratislava. Its employees experiment with new software solutions, collaborate with a local university, and adapt their products based on user feedback. Over time, they develop unique expertise that distinguishes them from competitors. This is a micro-level example of a learning process that, when multiplied across a region, can drive development. Innovation itself can take many forms. It can involve new products, new processes, new marketing strategies, or new organizational structures. What matters is not only the invention of something new, but its successful application in practice. To support innovation, regions must develop what we call regional innovation systems. These systems consist of firms, research institutions, service providers, and governmental bodies, all interacting within a network. The effectiveness of this system depends on the quality of relationships between its components. For example, the second largest city of the Czech Republic is Brno. There was developed a strong innovation ecosystem quite successfully. Universities, research centers, and technology firms collaborate closely, creating an environment conducive to innovation. Similar efforts can be observed in parts of Slovakia, although challenges remain, particularly in less developed regions. Now, despite the appeal of these theories, we must also consider their limitations. Critics argue that concepts such as clusters, learning regions, and innovation systems are difficult to measure and often lack empirical validation. Furthermore, they may be too context-specific to be applied universally. These criticisms are valid to some extent. However, it is important to understand that these theories are still evolving. They do not claim to provide definitive answers, but rather to offer new ways of thinking about regional development. And finally, in conclusion, what we have discussed today represents a shift from a purely economic understanding of development to a more complex, multidimensional perspective. We have moved from a focus on external inputs to an emphasis on internal capacities. We have recognized the importance of institutions, networks, and knowledge, and we have seen that innovation is not an isolated activity, but a collective process embedded in regional contexts. If there is one message I would like you to take away from this lecture, it is this: regions do not develop by accident. Their success depends on a delicate interplay of economic, social, and institutional factors. Understanding this interplay is essential not only for scholars, but also for policymakers and practitioners. Thank you for your attention.